Okay, hopefully this will get picked up on the camera. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Today's topic is it's a controversial topic. It's a very difficult topic. One of the reasons why it's such a difficult topic is because there aren't too many classic sources that deal specifically with this issue, the issue of civilian casualties in wartime, simply because for the past couple thousand years, up until the very modern era, Jews didn't fight too many wars. However, in the past 50, 60 years, it's become a very important topic, and it keeps on coming up over and over again. This past summer, it came up with the war in Gaza. It came up in Gaza again earlier in 2008 and 2002. Unfortunately, they've had a lot of experience lately in the past decade or so. So what I want to do is see if I can glean together a couple of sources and a couple of ideas and see perhaps if we could come to, I'm not going to say we're going to come to anything conclusive and definitive necessarily, but at least appreciate perhaps a couple of the issues and a couple of the sources. One of the challenges is going to be that some of the sources actually come from the Torah itself. Now, why is that a challenge? Because it's always very difficult to glean from the Torah when it comes to practical halakha. So we're going to be a little bit careful, but we'll see what, again, some of the classic commentators have to say. I'm going to start with the Geneva Convention. It was brought up earlier, as worthwhile mentioning. The Geneva Convention, I believe it was in 1949, spoke about the idea, which was essentially actually created to deal with the aftermath of the Nazi atrocities, and was essentially created to kind of put the Nazis on trial. And what's interesting about the Geneva Convention, that dealt specifically with casualties and civilian casualties in war. But it's a very ambiguous legal document. It's a very ambiguous legal document. And it's unclear exactly, have a seat. It's unclear of its almost practical ramifications in the real world. I'll give you an example, and I wish I would have had the text with me. But the Geneva Convention, when tries to define what exactly is a civilian. So we talk about civilian casualties in war. What's a civilian? Is a civilian someone who's working working on ammunition in a machinery somewhere, working in some factory? Is that considered a civilian? Is a civilian someone who, let's say, is supporting, who voted for terrorists, who are supporting and who are clapping and who are cheering on the terrorists? Is that considered a civilian? Right? So it's very unclear exactly what is the definition of a civilian. So when we talk about taking out civilian casualties in war, it's not so clear what a civilian is. Forget from a halakhic perspective, from a Jewish law perspective, but very simply from a Geneva Convention perspective, there's a lot of ambiguity. Also, something which really pains me to say, but the Geneva Convention, the United Nations has only come together 3 times to deal specifically with the issue of civilians during war since 1949. Guess what all the 3 times dealt with? The State of Israel. So they have this document, they have this quote-unquote legal document, and its application somehow miraculously only deals with, and they only gather and only apply it all of a sudden when it comes to the State of Israel. So that's also going to be very interesting. How do we deal with legal documents from a Jewish law perspective? So we'll maybe come to that a little bit later. I found in front of you from a very well-known rabbi called Wikipedia is where I want to start. If you take a look at the top of the page, I want to show you. I found this very interesting. This is a simple Google search. This is what it says. Listen to this. According to the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, which uses data independent of the Israeli military, Israeli targeted killings claimed 425 Palestinian lives between September of 2000 and August of 2011. Of these, 251 persons, just under 60%, were the targeted individuals, and approximately 41% were civilian bystanders. Now, again, it doesn't tell us what is a civilian bystander, right? So the fact the guy doesn't have a rocket launcher on his shoulder, right? Does that make him a civilian bystander? Right? They're not telling us any definitions here, which again is part of the ambiguity and the complexity of the issue. This implies a ratio of civilians to targets of 1:144 during the whole period. So that's pretty amazing. The civilian casualty ratio of the targeted killings was surveyed by Haaretz, which is an Israeli newspaper, military journalist Amos Harel. In 2002 and 2003, the ratio was 1:1, meaning 1 civilian killed for every targeted killed. Hillel called this period, quote, the dark days, before the relatively high civilian death tolls compared to later years. He attributed this to the Israeli Air Force practice of attacking targets even when they were located in densely populated areas. While there are always safety rules, argued Hillel, they were, quote-unquote, bent at times in view of the target's importance. I'll tell you what happened. A tremendous challenge took place in 2008. In 2008, one of the number 2 Hamas terrorists was caught by the Israeli Air Force. Caught him. They saw him in their sights, and they sent in an Apache helicopter to take him out. He looked up and he saw this Apache helicopter. And what did he do? He darted into a cab that was passing by, and inside the cab, the Israeli Air Force could see a young girl in the back of the cab with her mother, the cab driver, and this number 2 wanted terrorist of Hamas. So the Israeli Air Force was in a major moral dilemma. Do they shoot? Do they basically take out this cab, knowing for well that it will also take out 3 civilian casualties, but it will also take out, of course, this wanted terrorist? So I'm going to pose this to the table for a moment because it's worthwhile. Imagine, I realize this is extremely speculative and definitely not something about which we deal with, especially not in Toronto, on a day-to-day basis. But what would you do from a military perspective, a moral perspective, right? If you're that individual behind the Apache, would you take out that Hamas terrorist, which you had your sights on, which you've been following, and you finally actually can get? Again, knowing, however, that there's been a little bit botched because it's also going to take out civilians, in particular a mother and a young girl. Perhaps appearing the next day on CNN, front page of the website, what Israel did. What would you do in that situation? Do you say, listen, what are your thoughts? They want to volunteer. What would you do in such a scenario, and why?
You take it out because he has made them into hostages. All right, he has made them a human shield, and therefore, even by the Geneva Convention, that you are exempt from culpability if someone puts these civilians at risk. That combatant has the moral responsibility, the culpability for that.
Okay, so again, very good. It was interesting about the Geneva Convention is that it talks about civilian bystanders, but it also deals with what you're not allowed to do during war. I guess in the olden days, before World War I, every war was kind of fought on a battlefield, right? So you have the guys in the military fighting guys in the military. The women and the children were back home in the village, in the city. But war took place on a battlefield. World War I, they say, was one of the first times all of a sudden it shifted, where you actually have civilians and military targets kind of in very close proximity. World War II, we know what happened in World War II. What did America do? They dropped a nuclear bomb on Hiroshima. So that is one of the major episodes of taking out civilian casualties in war. Now, the historians actually tell us that was a major turning point in World War II. From what I heard, again, a little bit of research, the United States estimated that if they would have had to attack Japan from the land, they were expecting over 1 million United States soldier casualties had they had to go on land and attack Japan from the ground. That would have been, 1 million casualties is almost unfathomable in the course of war. So dropping the bomb clearly had a tremendous impact and really turned the tide in many ways, again, from a military strategic perspective. And we see the United States government took out these civilians, again, in the course of war. So here we actually have a very interesting episode, because here, first of all, question number one is we have to ask ourselves, wait a second, is this even a war? Meaning, is Israel, again, here's what's changed. What exactly? In the olden days, it was easy. What's a war? Bang, 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 bang. Take a sword, fight people face to face. The question is Israel at war with Hamas? So we use the term war, but, is it like a legal war? Does it have the halachic terminology of a war, which we'll have to talk about also a little bit later? So is this even a war? Again, it's not conventional. So to some extent, we don't even almost know how to deal with it, even from a United Nations perspective. Sorry?
It's an immediate threat because he's he's prepared to attack, regardless of what's in.
Right. So we know that. What did Hamas do? They literally launched thousands of rockets into civilian populations. right? So it would appear that's definitely almost it's an aggression. It's almost an act of war, right? Imagine if, Niagara Falls, Ontario were to drop a missile into Niagara Falls, New York, right? What would happen after one missile? Probably the whole country would be almost leveled, right? But Israel, we know, faced thousands and thousands of rockets on a daily basis, and they clearly intentionally wanted to attack civilian sites. At some point in time, and again, it took a tremendous amount of time until Israel retaliated, right? Anyone remember what happened in Jenin? Jenin in 2002 is another famous example. In Jenin in it's the summer of 2002. What was his name? The Minister of Defense. Who was the Minister of Defense 2002? Who was it? No, it was Mufaz. It was before Mufaz. I can't remember his name. Again, another famous dilemma in Jenin. They released this. What made this issue famous was that he was interviewed by a journalist. I'll explain to you briefly what took place. 2002, there was a Jenin which was known as a hotbed of terrorism. The military was told that in a certain house was where many of the leaders were hanging out. However, they also knew that if they sent in foot soldiers, the whole place was booby-trapped. And therefore, it was recommended by the military just to strike it with an Apache helicopter, taking it out. Again, knowing that there'd be civilian casualties, but that is what they recommended to the Minister of Defense. The Minister of Defense went against the IDF and actually said, no, send in foot soldiers. You might recall 2002, 13 was one of the worst days in all of the history of Israel, at least in modern times. 13 Israeli soldiers were killed during that attack in Jenin. And why? Because it was the minister of the minister of the Israeli government who actually, because he has that ability from a governmental perspective, who decided to. Why? Because he was afraid of, the newspaper was afraid of political considerations, and therefore he sent in soldiers, and unfortunately something terrible occurred. So we see that they really have to deal with this on a regular basis, and we need to understand as Jews, what is our moral barometer, what's our ethical barometer, how are we supposed to make such decisions, and how are these even governed? And we know that Israel is such a mortal enemy in the past war, again, this became very famous. Only Israel, what would they do? They get a hold of people's cell phones, right? And they would call them to say, we're coming in and we're bombing, and they would call them ahead of time. Right? Or they would drop leaflets, and they'd say, we are coming in. So one could even argue, and there were those who wanted to, wait a second, what are you talking about civilians? Didn't they all leave? And in fact, in Jenin, this was already day 10 or day 11 of the war, most civilians, the vast majority of civilians already left, because they knew it was in the middle of a war. And therefore they ran away. So again, what exactly is the moral, halachic, Jewish law and Jewish thought have to say about all these issues? It's an interesting topic. Okay, let's see some sources. Flip the page. Sources are very difficult to come by. Not so simple to find sources. There's one parsha in the Torah which deals with a little bit of combat and a bit of war. I'm going to talk a bit outside before I see sources inside. There's a story that takes place where Yaakov is very scared to fight Esav. Esav is coming. It's in Genesis. It's not there in front of you. I'm going to tell you. It's chapter 36 in Genesis. What? Very good. Who's your father? So the Gemara, the Talmud says something very important, that Jacob is prepared to attack his brother Esav, and he does a number of different things. He prays, he sets up a military strategy. There the Talmud comments, why was he so scared? It says that Esav was coming with 400 military men. Arba'ah me'ot anashim. What was he scared about? It says the Talmud, he was very scared. What was he scared? That he was going to have to kill innocent people. The Talmud asks, innocent people? Esav is coming. He's a warrior. 400 military men. Who are these innocent people? So there perhaps one can say, what do you mean? Is it there may be only Esav will be the one to draw the sword, and Yaakov and Yaakov's team, Yaakov's family might take out maybe someone who is considered innocent. Or shall we say not yielding a sword at that very moment. It appears from here that there are those who want to argue that, maybe we should be concerned with civilian casualties. People say, you know what? No. You'll notice it didn't prevent Jacob from wanting to engage in that military conflict. He was just worried and concerned about it. Not that he didn't do it, and he was prepared to do it. And therefore, generally speaking, this is dismissed as a source to prove that we shouldn't attack civilian combatants because, A, they were joining with Esau, who was prepared to fight, and at the same time, Yaakov was so prepared to engage in battle, he was just worried, and it bothered him that he might, shall we say, take out one of the people with him. You know, Golda Meir, I remember the famous line by Golda Meir, right? What did Golda Meir say? We can forgive the Arabs for, I know the famous line, for making, remember the line? For killing our kids, but we can't forgive them for making us having to kill them. Famous line. I'm not quite sure about the first line either is correct, but nonetheless, a statement by Golda Meir, it's a powerful statement because it's true. So again, Yaakov recognized that he might need to fight, he might need to defend himself, and that bothered him. It bothered him, but it didn't prevent him from, shall we say, preparing to attack. So one could even argue maybe this could be a source to say, you know, that for self-defense, it can bother you. Nothing wrong with having it bother you, but you have to be prepared to do it. There's another famous, perhaps even more of an episode. This is probably the main source, or one of the main sources in the Torah for defense. And that's what I want to focus on a little bit now. And it's the following. There's a story in Genesis, in Bereshit, that says the following. There's a lady by the name of Dinah. She's taken captive. She's taken captive by two guys. The name are Hamor and Shechem. So they're taken captive. She's taken captive. Her brothers, Shimon and Levi, come in, and they wipe out the entire city. Not only do they wipe out the entire city, but they kind of trick the city. They make them become circumcised. And shall we say, when they're in tremendous amount of pain, that's when Shimon and Levi come in, and they wipe the whole city. Were they justified in wiping out the entire city? It's a well-known argument among two major commentators, medieval thinkers, I should say. One is source number 2. The Ramban on the Torah says, number 2, says the Ramban that what they did was a terrible thing. Take a look at source 2. I'm not happy. It was not pleased with what they did. If they were justified in behaving, who should have gone out to attack them? Not Shimon and Levi, Dad, Yaakov. Why didn't Jacob himself go and attack the village if it was the right and justified thing to do? The Ramban says that what they did was totally inappropriate. That's exactly the Gemara in Sanhedrin. That's what my son's referring to. Okay, that's source number 1. That's a source. Let's jump to source number 1, the first source. Says Maimonides, the Rambam, in the laws of warfare, Hilchot Melachim, or deals laws of warfare, I should say. He says the following. He says that non-Jews are obligated to perform certain commandments, and one of the commandments is that the non-Jewish world, we know, according to the tradition, the Jews have to uphold 613 laws, and according to our tradition, the non-Jews have to keep what's called Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, the 7 Noahide laws. But the 7 Noahide laws are actually way more than 7, they're just 7 really categories. They have a lot of other categories as well, a lot of more laws as well. But says the Rambam, what do they need to do? Let's read inside, you can follow along. Chayavim lahoshiv dinim v'shoftim b'chol plach u'plach ladun b'shesh mitzvot elu. Says Maimonides, every non-Jew is obligated in every village and every city to set up a court system. Out of the 7 Noahide laws, 6 are negative, 1's positive. What's the one positive law? They must establish a court system. Why did a court system? How else are you going to uphold the 6 laws? So says Maimonides, every single, basically, city, village in the world needs a court system. Both Jews and non-Jews need a court system. Says Maimonides, you need to have a court system to warn the people. This you can do, this you can't do, you got to uphold, you need justice. And a non-Jew who violates one of these laws is put to death. And this is what's interesting. Maimonides doesn't have a clear commentary on the Torah, but here he tangentially refers to our episode. And what does the Maimonides say? What does the Rambam write? Says the Rambam, the entire city of Shechem was deserving of death. Why? Shechem Gazal. So Shechem is both. Shechem is the city and the mayor. Okay. name a city after you, right? That's like calling it, Toronto is also, a Tory, right? Tory town, right? So here we go. Says the Rambam, since the mayor didn't uphold the law, and since no one went out against him, and after all, the mayor went out and stole kidnapping. Kidnapping is a federal offense, a capital offense. They didn't take him to court. Ben Noach Neharag, therefore, every single one of them was deserving of death. It's a very, very harsh statement by the Rambam. Very harsh statement, and that's what he uses to justify the behavior of Shimon and Levi. Now, there's a few problems with this Rambam. Problem number one. Wait a second. Question. You mean to tell me that you expect people in the town to drag their mayor to court? And this is thousands of years ago. In the modern era, we know how difficult it is to bring political people to trial. Even in the modern era. In those days, there's a concept in Jewish law called ones rachamane patre. That if there's something that you just simply can't do, it's just too above and beyond what you're able to accomplish, you're actually exempt. So the commentators, the modern day decisive authorities, they try to use this as a source to justify taking out civilian casualties. They say, what are you talking about? How can you use this as a source? Maimonides. Maybe you want to, how can you justify what you said? After all, how are these guys able to Shem and take him to court? He's the mayor. Maybe they should be exempt from it. And to apply it to a modern context, if let's say there's a civilian, by the way, let's assume, and again, I'm making an assumption, let's say there's a really good guy who lives in Hamas. There are people, we know, not everyone wants war. And he wishes that Hamas would disappear or make peace, and he wishes all he wants to do is get a good, solid job in Israel and travel. Fine. You blame him for not taking Hamas to court? Are you kidding me? Any person, we know that any person who even tries and, to tell the Israeli government that what happens to these guys, they get hanged, they get killed, right? Can I blame someone living in Gaza? Can I blame someone for not, shall we say, going to the authorities, maybe the Palestinian authorities, or ratting them in Israel? I can't blame them. It takes a tremendous amount of moral courage. You're putting your life in danger, right? Maybe they should do it, but again, you're going to blame, and because of that, they should be deserving of death? Very difficult statement to make by Maimonides. But here is, gentlemen, this is the source that many people use to justify taking out civilian casualties. It's source number 3. It's the Gur Aryeh. The Gur Aryeh is a commentary in the Torah, which was written by the Maharami Prague, who's a late medieval commentator. Generally speaking, the Gur Aryeh deals with moral messages and theological messages. Very rarely does he deal with Jewish law, but all of a sudden he embeds a very powerful law that's very applicable to us. Take a look at source number 3. He justifies the behavior of Shimon and Levi. Why? Because he says this is the status of war. And in war, civilians get killed. That's the way it goes. He argues, what? That when it comes to war, civilians get killed as part of war. And he says, why were Shimon and Levi justified? Not because of Maimonides, not because they didn't uphold the court of law. They were justified because in war, you go out and you take out people. And, so the Maharami Prague says, this is a war. It's called Jews versus the Shechemites or something, right? And since the Bnei Yisrael, the status of the nation of Israel, right? They had the status of the Jewish people at that time. Therefore, it wasn't an individualized war. It was the nation of Israel. A Jewish lady was kidnapped. It was a declaration of war. Kidnapping is a declaration of war. By the way, this has ramifications when the enemy kidnaps soldiers. It's a declaration of war. Not that maybe you even need that today. And therefore, since it's a declaration of war, the Gur Aryeh wants to say that is what you do. Whether you agree with his, you want to argue it's a nation, not a nation. To some extent, it's not going to matter for our purpose, because look what he says in source 3. Lefichach, hu Hutar lahem lulchom kedin, uma sheba lulchom al uma cheret. It is permissible, according to Jewish law, to take out another nation when it comes to war. Kevan shepartu them tchila. If, and only if, you're attacked first. So if you're defending yourself, you're not allowed to engage in war first. Say, let's attack those guys. Oh, not only let's attack them, but since it's war, we can actually knock out their civilians. No. Says the Maharal, if it's a war, and again, I'm making an assumption which I don't believe is such a leap, that Israel right now is in the status of war. Four eminent modern-day poskim argue definitively that Israel is in a constant state of war. Rav Hershel Schachter, the Rosh Kol of Yeshiva University, in many, many different places, writes that Israel is in the status of war. And therefore, they're always on the defense. Fighting in Israel is considered a mitzvah because it's clearly defending the people. This is agreed to by very preeminent scholars in Israel. Rav Shul Yisraeli, Rav Dov Lior, well-known Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Vadia Yosef wrote about it in many of his tshuvot as well, that Israel in the status of war. Rav Usher Weiss, in Minchas Usher, writes it as well. Generally, there's a few who disagree, but the prevailing modern, contemporary rabbinic world says that Israel is in the status of war, despite the fact that it's not your typical, battlefield bang, bang, bang war. But the reality of Israel is that they're always, to some extent, in this status of this threat that is always looming over them. And the proof is very simple. If Israel would put down their arms tomorrow, there would probably be no Israel that day or the next day, unfortunately. Let's continue. Says the Gur Aryeh, if you're attacked first, you can defend yourself in revenge. The Hachinami, here we go. Kol hamilchamot shehem nimtzaim. Sorry? If they attack first, right. So, here we go. Says the Gur Aryeh, and this is true in all wars. And he uses the example, Saror at the Midianim. Let me give you what happens in the end of, we're starting Parsha Sefer Bamidbar. Towards the end of Bamidbar, the Jewish people are attacked by Midian. And what happens? Moshe gets up and says, seek vengeance against the Midianim. Every single person in Midian is guilty, is culpable? So says the Gur Aryeh, we see from here, we were attacked first, we could defend ourselves. And yes, when it comes to defending yourselves, it even sometimes can mean take out civilian casualties. When the United States dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, they took them out, they were attacked first, clearly they were attacked first, the United States. And in America, in retaliation, they retaliated. It was a strategic move, both from a military perspective, and clearly we know it had an impact on the outcome of the war as well. And there are many people that were, I'm sure, killed with that bomb that were innocent civilians. There's no question.
How about in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah?
Sodom and Gomorrah is not war. There's no war. There's no war in Sodom and Gomorrah. They didn't capture Lod. Lod voluntarily went there. So that problem might have a status. It's a good question. That might not have a status of nation versus nation, right? That's taking Lod. Lod's an individual. Lod's not a nation. It's very clear. It's not an individual. Meaning, and that's also very important. We don't have one guy attacks me, doesn't mean I can go, bomb the guy's whole house. That's also very important. This is talking about a nation versus a nation. So that's the word. This is not individuals. This is not a block. This is nation versus nation. That's a good, important distinction to make. And it continues the Gur Aryeh, Av al Gav Dahayu Harbe Shelo Asu Ein Zachiluk. Even though, says Gur Aryeh, there are many people in Midian who didn't attack the Jewish people. But the fact that as a nation attacked another nation, attacked Israel, Israel has the halachic moral right of self-defense, and that's what happens in war. Innocent civilians get killed. And they're part of this evil nation. Mutarin lavol and milchama is permissible to attack them in war. V'chein hem kol milchamot, and this is Maharal, is the case with all wars. This Maharal, this Gur Aryeh, is the linchpin that is used in many modern-day contemporary rabbinic authorities who justify taking out civilian casualties in war because it's war. Israel is engaged in modern war.